The architecture of your day, how the first hour shapes everything that follows. Every morning, before you even open your eyes, your brain is already making decisions. The alarm goes off somewhere across the room, or right beside your head. And in that thin, fragile space between sleep and waking, you make one of the most consequential choices of your day. Not the choice to get up or stay in bed, something deeper than that. You choose, without realizing it, what kind of person you're going to be for the next 16 hours. This is where the architecture of your life is built, not in the grand moments, not in the breakthrough meetings or the milestone anniversaries or the once-in-a-lifetime opportunities, but here, in the quiet, unremarkable space of a Tuesday morning when nothing seems to matter and everything feels the same as yesterday. Here's a truth most people spend their whole lives running from. You already have the power to change your life, not someday, not when the conditions improve, when the timing is right, when you finally feel ready. Right now, today, in the next decision you make. The problem isn't that people lack the ability to change. The problem is that they hand that ability over to circumstance, to mood, to the invisible pull of habit, and then wonder why nothing ever shifts. Consider what actually happens in the average morning. The phone comes out before the feet hit the floor. Notifications from last night's conversations, headlines demanding attention, the algorithmic parade of other people's lives. Before you've said a word to yourself, before you've even fully arrived in your own body, the world has already begun telling you who you are and what matters. This is not neutral. This is architecture, and you did not design it. Now contrast that with a different morning. Same city, same apartment, same alarm, but this time the phone stays face down for 30 minutes. Instead, there's a moment, just a moment, of deliberate stillness, a question asked silently to no one in particular. Who do I want to be today? Not what do I need to accomplish, not what problems need solving, not who needs something from me. Who do I want to be? That question changes everything, and yet almost nobody asks it. Marcus grew up in Johannesburg, South Africa, the third of 5 children in a household that never had quite enough of anything. Not space, not money, not time. By his mid-30s, he'd built a successful logistics company, employed 43 people, and had everything on paper that people spend decades working toward. And yet every Sunday evening he felt a creeping dread that he couldn't name. Every Monday morning he moved through the day on autopilot, responding, reacting, managing, but never truly leading, not his company, not his life. It wasn't until a long flight from Johannesburg to Amsterdam, with 8 hours of enforced stillness and no Wi-Fi, that Marcus asked himself the question he'd been avoiding for years. Am I choosing this life, or am I just living it by default? That question, deceptively simple, devastatingly honest, is the one this guide is built around. Because the difference between people who feel genuinely alive and people who feel perpetually behind isn't talent or luck or circumstance. It's the degree to which they are the authors of their own daily experience, rather than its audience. You cannot always control what happens around you. You cannot orchestrate the economy, the weather, other people's behavior, or the 1,000 small disruptions that arrive without warning on any given day. What you can control, completely, absolutely, every single time, is how you meet what comes. And that meeting begins in the morning, in that architectural decision before the day has had a chance to tell you who you are. Most people, when they think about changing their lives, think about the big moves, the new job, the new city, the new relationship, the dramatic reinvention. But transformation doesn't work that way. Transformation is granular. It happens in the repeated accumulation of tiny decisions, each one so small it seems almost meaningless, and yet each one carving millimeter by millimeter the shape of the person you're becoming. Think about it this way. A river doesn't cut through stone by force. It does it through consistency, through showing up every single day at the same place with the same patient, steady pressure. Water doesn't muscle its way through granite. It simply returns again and again until the granite yields. That is how character is built. That is how a life is changed, not through the grand gesture, but through the humble return. Every morning, every decision, every small moment of choosing who you are. So, what does this actually look like in practice? Start with your morning, not as a ritual to perfect, but as a signal to send, not to the world, to yourself. The first hour of your day is a declaration. It says, I am someone who takes my life seriously. Or it says, I am someone who lets the current carry me. And the strange, uncomfortable truth is that whichever one you declare, you will prove yourself right. When you start the day reactively, phone first, news first, other people's emergencies first, you are telling your nervous system that you are not in charge, that the world sets the agenda, that you are a responder, not a creator. This is not a judgment. It is simply what the nervous system hears, and it shapes everything that follows. Your decision-making becomes clouded. Your priorities blur. By noon, you are exhausted from managing other people's urgencies, and the things you actually care about have somehow never made it onto the schedule. When you start the day intentionally, even for 15 minutes, even imperfectly, you send a completely different signal. You are saying, I came first. My direction matters. I will engage with the world from a place of orientation, not desperation. That signal changes how you handle the first difficult conversation of the day. It changes how you respond when the plan falls apart at 10 a.m. It changes what you decide to prioritize at 3 p.m. when energy is fading and the easy choice is to defer everything to tomorrow. None of this requires a 90-minute morning routine with cold showers and meditation and journaling and a protein shake. It requires a decision. A quiet, private, deeply personal declaration made to yourself before the noise begins. Yuki lives in Osaka, Japan, and works 14-hour days in a competitive tech startup environment that prizes output above almost everything else. For years, she told herself that there was no time for intentional mornings. She needed every minute. She would set 3 alarms, lie in bed, scrolling through work messages until the last possible second, and then launch herself into the day like someone thrown from a moving vehicle, reactive, frantic, always slightly behind. She started waking up 20 minutes earlier. Not an hour. 20 minutes. She didn't meditate or journal. She sat at her kitchen table with tea and asked herself one question. What is the one thing that, if I do it well today, will make everything else feel worth it? Just one thing. Then she wrote it down and put her phone in another room for those 20 minutes. Within 3 weeks, her colleagues noticed something different about her. Not that she worked more, she actually worked slightly less. But her decisions were clearer. She was less reactive in meetings. She stopped apologizing for her opinions. She said no to 2 projects that she would previously have accepted just to avoid the discomfort of setting a limit. And she finished the project that had been sitting half done for 9 months. 20 minutes. 1 question, 1 written answer. That was the architecture. Everything else followed. Here's what nobody tells you about motivation. You cannot wait for it. Motivation is not a resource that arrives before action. It is a resource that arrives because of action. You act first, imperfectly, reluctantly, even badly, and motivation emerges from the momentum of having started. This is one of the most important practical truths about human psychology, and almost no one applies it because it requires tolerating the discomfort of beginning before you feel ready. Feeling ready is a feeling. Feelings are temporary, shifting, unreliable narrators of your actual capacity. You have never been ready for the most important things you've done in your life. You were nervous, uncertain, underprepared, and you did them anyway. That is precisely where your strength lives. Not in the confident moments, but in the uncertain ones where you moved forward regardless. Discipline is not a personality trait you either have or don't have. It is a practice, a series of repeated, deliberate choices that over time become less effortful because they have become structural. The people who seem naturally disciplined are not fundamentally different from you. They have simply repeated their chosen behaviors long enough that not doing them feels wrong. They have built an architecture that makes the right choice the easy choice. But discipline begins, always, every time, with a decision that has nothing to do with how you feel. It begins with the quiet, interior commitment. Regardless of how I feel right now, I will do what I said I would do. That commitment, honored consistently, is the foundation upon which everything else is built. Your health, your relationships, your professional impact, your sense of yourself as someone reliable, someone capable, someone who shows up, and showing up, genuinely, fully, with intention rather than just physical presence, is rarer than you think. Most people are present in their lives the way you might be present at a movie you didn't choose. Sitting there, technically, but somewhere else entirely. The question isn't whether you're going through the motions of your life. The question is whether you're writing them. Every morning, you have the opportunity to rewrite. Not your past, that is fixed. Not your circumstances, those take time to shift. But your orientation, your stance, the internal posture with which you meet whatever the day brings. And over time, this invisible, unremarkable daily rewriting produces something astonishing. A life that actually resembles the person you know yourself to be. A life that isn't just happened upon, but chosen. That is the architecture of a day worth living. And it begins before the notifications, before the obligations, before the world tells you who you are. It begins with you, in the quiet, asking, "Who do I want to be today?" Then answering, then acting accordingly. The extraordinary people you admire, the ones who seem to move through their lives with clarity and purpose and something that looks almost effortful, are not operating in different circumstances than you. They are operating from a different starting point. The same alarm, the same limited hours, the same unpredictable interruptions, but a different first decision, a different morning declaration. The noise is temporary. The architecture is what you build. And here is the part that most people miss. This is not about becoming someone else. It's about becoming more consistently, more deliberately, more fully yourself. The person you already sense you could be, in your best moments, when you're not tired or distracted or reactive or afraid. That person is not hypothetical. That person is available. That person is the architecture underneath all the noise. Start building it tomorrow morning, not perfectly, just intentionally. That's all it takes to begin. The life you actually want. Why most people never stop to ask. At some point, usually in the middle of a perfectly ordinary Wednesday, or at 3 a.m. when sleep won't come, the question surfaces, not loudly, almost gently, like a hand on your shoulder from behind. Is this actually the life I want? Most people hear this question and immediately busy themselves with something. Another task, another episode, another scroll through someone else's highlight reel. because the question is terrifying in its implications. If the answer is no, or even maybe, then something has to change. And change is uncomfortable in ways that are very specific and very personal. You might disappoint people, you might lose ground, you might discover that you've been wrong about what matters, and you'll have to sit with that. So the question goes unanswered. Life continues. The calendar fills up. Years pass. And this quiet, sustained avoidance of the most important question you could ever ask yourself is how a life gets spent rather than lived. Here is a truth that takes courage to sit with. The life you are currently living is, in significant measure, a life you chose by not choosing. Every time you deferred the decision about what you actually wanted, you implicitly chose what was already there, the default, the expected, the path of least resistance. This isn't a criticism. It is simply what happens when we are too close to our own lives to see them clearly, too busy surviving to stop and ask what thriving would look like. Amara grew up in Lagos, Nigeria, in a family where ambition was expected and visible. Success was the primary language of love. By 29, she had a finance career that her parents held up as evidence of everything the family had worked for. She was good at her job. She was rewarded for it. She bought an apartment in a part of the city that meant something. And she sat in that apartment on weeknights after 12-hour days and felt an emptiness so complete it frightened her, because she had no framework for it. She had done everything right, so why didn't it feel like anything? What Amara had never been given permission to ask was this: right by whose definition? She had been handed a vision of a successful life, complete with its specific aesthetics, its particular achievements, its recognized markers, and she had pursued it with extraordinary dedication. But she had never stopped to ask whether the vision was hers, whether the life she was building was built around her actual values, her actual desires, her actual sense of meaning. She had been so busy executing a plan that she had never paused to examine whether she had chosen it. This is not unusual. This is epidemic. The pressure to live an externally legible life, a life that makes sense to others, that demonstrates value in recognizable ways, that earns approval from people whose approval we've decided matters, is one of the most powerful forces shaping human behavior, and it operates largely invisibly. We don't consciously think, I am living this way because I need other people to approve of me. We just find ourselves making choices that keep the approval coming, and we call those choices practical or responsible or realistic, and we keep making them until we are very far from the life we would have designed from scratch. Designing a life from scratch is what this section is about. Not in a romantic, impractical sense. You have real obligations, real relationships, real constraints that matter and must be honored. But within those constraints, there is far more space than you've likely claimed. There is the space to decide what you actually care about, what kind of person you want to be, as opposed to what kind of person others have decided you should be. What you would build if you stopped trying to build a life that looks good and started trying to build a life that feels right. The first step is also the hardest because it requires an honesty that can be uncomfortable. You have to separate what you want from what you think you should want. These are not the same thing. The life your family imagined for you, however much love went into that imagining, is not necessarily your life. The success your professional culture defines, however much status it confers, may not be your success. The version of happiness that photographs well and generates the right comments online is not the same as the version that makes you feel genuinely, quietly, privately satisfied when the phone is away and no one is watching. That privately satisfied version is the one worth building. It is also the only version that is sustainable because it is the only one that doesn't require an audience to validate it. So, what do you actually want? Not the curated answer, not the answer that makes you look good or sounds appropriately ambitious or doesn't make people worry about you. The real answer, the one you've been keeping slightly out of focus because looking at it directly feels like opening a door you might not be able to close. If you don't know, and many people genuinely don't because they've spent years not asking, here is a way to find out. Think about the moments in your life when you felt most alive, not most successful, not most productive, not most admired, most alive. When did you forget to check your phone? When did time collapse in the most wonderful way so that you looked up and hours had passed? When did you feel like what you were doing and who you are were exactly aligned? Those moments contain information. They are not accidents. They point toward something. Daniel is a structural engineer in Berlin who had spent 15 years designing frameworks for buildings and 0 years designing a framework for his own life. He was methodical in his professional work, creative in his problem-solving, and almost completely improvisational when it came to his own direction. He took the jobs that appeared. He stayed in relationships until they ended. He bought the apartment in the neighborhood his colleagues recommended. He was, by his own description, technically fine. At 41, his company went through a restructuring. His role changed in ways that made him realize how entirely he had outsourced the question of what he wanted his work to be. He began, slowly, awkwardly, to ask himself what he would design if he were designing his own life with the same rigor he brought to buildings. What would the structural requirements be? What needed to bear weight? What was decorative and could be removed without compromising integrity? What he discovered over several months of uncomfortable reflection was that he wanted to teach. He had always found the most meaning in explaining, in translating complexity into clarity, in watching understanding emerge in someone who had been confused moments before. He had rationalized this as just a communication preference. It was actually a signal about what he was for. Within 2 years, he had transitioned into teaching engineering at a university, kept a small number of consulting clients, and described his life as something he recognizes. Not perfect, not free of difficulty, but recognizable as his. This is what choosing looks like, not dramatic, not instantaneous. A series of honest questions leading to gradually clearer answers, leading to increasingly deliberate decisions. The mistake people make when they talk about finding themselves is that they think it's a discovery, something hidden that needs to be excavated. It's actually a construction. You don't find the person you're meant to be. You build that person, decision by decision, over time, out of the raw material of what you value and what you're willing to commit to. And it requires saying no. This is the part people underestimate. A defined life is not just about what you include. It is equally and necessarily about what you exclude. Every yes is also, implicitly, a no to something else. When you are not conscious about this trade, you accumulate a life full of things you said yes to out of inertia, obligation, or fear of the alternative. When you become conscious about it, you begin to curate, gently, honestly, without cruelty, a life that is genuinely yours. Saying no to things that are wrong for you is not selfishness. It is the most honest thing you can do for yourself and for everyone involved. It is what makes the yes meaningful. If you say yes to everything, your yes means nothing. It is not a commitment. It is an avoidance of the discomfort of refusal. The clearer you are about what you want, really want, not performatively want, the easier the no's become. You stop spending energy justifying them or apologizing for them. You simply see that this particular thing, however appealing it might be to someone else, is not part of the life you are building. And that is enough. There is also the matter of scale. When people think about the life they want, they tend to think in large, photogenic units. The career change, the move to a different country, the radical reinvention. But this is not where real change primarily lives. Real change lives in the unglamorous daily calibration of priorities, in the consistent small choices that, accumulated over months and years, produce a life that either resembles you or doesn't. What you spend your evenings on, what you read, who you make time for when you don't have to, what you practice when no one is grading you. These are the actual building blocks of the life you're creating. The big decisions matter, yes, but the big decisions follow naturally from the accumulated small ones. If you spend 5 years making small choices that move toward clarity, purpose, and authenticity, the big choice becomes obvious. It is already made by the time you consciously face it. Conversely, if you spend 5 years making small choices out of convenience, approval-seeking, and avoidance, you eventually find yourself facing a life that is technically fine and internally hollow. And the big choice becomes terrifying because you've had no practice making smaller ones. So, start small. Ask the small questions consistently. What am I choosing right now, and why? Does this serve the person I'm trying to become? Is this mine, or am I carrying it for someone else? You do not have to blow up your life to live the right one. You have to pay attention to it, methodically, honestly, without flinching. And you have to be willing to slowly, deliberately, kindly release the things that were never yours to begin with. The life you actually want is not hidden. It's available right now, in this conversation you're having with yourself. It begins not with a dramatic revelation, but with a quiet decision to take the question seriously, to sit with it, to let the answer be imperfect and incomplete and honest, rather than polished and impressive and borrowed. What do you want? Really want? Answer that, and the rest begins to move. The world is full of people who are impressive to others and invisible to themselves. Don't spend another decade being one of them. The life that will actually satisfy you is the life you choose, not the one you accumulated. The difference between those two things is the difference between waking up on a Monday morning with a sense of purpose and waking up on a Monday morning with a sense of dread. Both are available to you. You get to decide which one it is. The growth you keep postponing. Why staying safe is the most dangerous thing you can do. There is a particular kind of pain that comes not from what happens to you, but from what you keep not doing. It is quieter than the pain of failure, less dramatic than the pain of loss, but it is persistent, and over time it compounds. It is the pain of potential unrealized, of the person you sense you could be, watching the person you've settled for being move through the days. You know this pain. Almost everyone does. It shows up in the slightly flat feeling, at the end of a day you can't quite call meaningful, in the vague restlessness that descends on Sunday evenings, in the moments when you see someone doing the thing you've told yourself you'll do one day, and you feel a pang that isn't quite envy. It's recognition. That could be you. It should be you. Why isn't it you? The answer, almost always, is not circumstance. It is not lack of talent or unfavorable timing or the wrong starting conditions. The answer is the specific, carefully maintained comfort zone you have built around yourself, brick by brick, rationalization by rationalization, and defended against every invitation to leave it. Comfort is not your friend. It is a very convincing, very soft-spoken enemy. It tells you that you are being sensible. That now is not the right time, that you need more preparation, more certainty, more proof that the risk is worth it before you take it. It sounds like wisdom, it feels like safety, and it keeps you exactly where you are, growing older, growing softer, growing quietly more resentful of a life that never quite delivered what you were waiting to ask for. Growth. Real growth, the kind that changes who you are rather than just what you know, requires a confrontation with discomfort that most people spend enormous energy engineering around. They read about growth. They follow people who talk about growth. They go to conferences and watch videos and tell themselves that they are preparing to grow. And they do not grow because growth is not a consumption activity, it is a production activity. It requires output, risk, exposure, and the specific vulnerability of trying something you might fail at. Here is the pattern, almost universal. People wait to feel ready before they act. And readiness never quite arrives, because readiness is not a state that precedes action. It is a state that follows it. You do not feel ready and then jump. You jump and discover in the falling that you had the capacity to land. Priya left Bangalore for São Paulo at 32 to build a branch of her company's operations in a market she knew nothing about, in a city where she didn't speak the language, with a team she'd never met. She was terrified in a way that was almost physical, a constant low-grade hum of dread that she carried for the first 3 months. She made mistakes that were embarrassing. She misread the culture. She over-communicated when she should have listened and went quiet when she should have spoken. She failed in the specific, necessary, instructive ways that only real action produces. By the end of 18 months, she had built something that worked. Not because she had figured out how to avoid failing, but because she had accepted that failing was the process. Each mistake was information. Each miscalculation pointed toward a better calibration. She wasn't the same person who had stepped off the plane in São Paulo. She was sharper, more resilient, more honest about what she didn't know, and more confident in what she did. She had grown, not despite the discomfort, but entirely because of it. This is the mechanism of growth. Discomfort applied consistently produces capacity. Every time you do the thing you were afraid to do and survive it, your nervous system registers that survival and recalibrates your estimate of what you can handle. Every time you stay in the uncomfortable conversation instead of deflecting, every time you try the new approach instead of defaulting to the familiar one, every time you commit to a standard instead of quietly lowering it, you become more capable, not more comfortable. More capable, these are not the same thing, and confusing them is how people end up in lives that are technically safe and deeply unsatisfying. The growth you keep postponing has a cost. It is not a neutral act, this continuous deferral. Every day you don't take the step you know you should take is a day that does something to you. It normalizes not taking the step. It reinforces the narrative that you are someone who waits. For permission, for perfect conditions, for someone to tell you it's safe to go. And once that narrative is embedded deeply enough, it becomes the primary thing you have to overcome. Not the challenge itself, but the story you've built about your relationship to challenge. Because here is what the people who grow consistently know that others don't. The feeling of not being ready is not a signal to wait. It is a signal that you are at the edge of your current capacity, which is exactly where growth happens. The discomfort you feel before you do the hard thing is not evidence that you shouldn't do it. It is evidence that doing it will change you. What is the thing you've been postponing? Not the vague category of getting better or making changes. The specific thing. The conversation you haven't had. The application you haven't sent. The project you've started 3 times and abandoned before it became real. The health habit you've been intending to build since January of a year you'd rather not count. The creative thing you keep telling yourself you'll do when you have more time, knowing that more time is not coming, and that time is not actually the obstacle, because here is what is guaranteed. It will not become easier by waiting. The window of readiness does not widen with time. If anything, it narrows. The longer you wait to take the risk, the more elaborate the reasons for not taking it become. The story gets more sophisticated, more detailed, more convincing, and keeps you more effectively in place. The antidote to postponement is not motivation. Motivation is the wrong tool. Motivation is weather. It changes, you can't control it, and organizing your growth around its presence or absence is a strategy for staying exactly where you are. The antidote to postponement is a decision followed immediately by the smallest possible action. Not a plan, not a commitment to eventually act. An action, now, however small, however imperfect, however far from the finished version of whatever you're trying to build. Kofi works in Accra, Ghana, as an accountant for a mid-sized firm. For 6 years he'd been developing an app in his evenings and weekends, slowly, tentatively, never quite far enough to show anyone. He told himself he was perfecting it. He was not perfecting it. He was protecting himself from the moment when it became real enough that people could have opinions about it. The app stayed safely in progress, safely private, safely not yet. And he stayed safely someone who was going to launch something rather than someone who had. A colleague asked to see what he'd been building. Just a conversation. Kofi showed it to him, braced for criticism. His colleague thought it was more than ready. He connected Kofi with someone who could help him take the next step. 6 weeks later, the app was live. Not perfect, real. The gap between where Kofi was and where he wanted to be was not a technical gap. It was an action gap. The specific, narrow, terrifying space between having something and showing it. The crossing of that gap cost him one decision and about 12 minutes of discomfort. 6 years of postponement, 12 minutes of action. You are not behind. You are exactly where your decisions have brought you. And that means you can be somewhere entirely different. Growth is not a destination, it is a practice. The daily, unglamorous discipline of choosing challenge over comfort in the small and medium-sized moments that make up a life. Not once, dramatically, in a peak moment of inspiration, every day. Even on the days when inspiration is nowhere to be found and the comfortable option is right there, familiar and warm and utterly stagnating. The version of you that you want to become is not waiting on the other side of perfect conditions. It is waiting on the other side of the thing you haven't done yet. Every single time you choose to do it anyway, you get a little closer. One choice, then another, then another. That is how the postponing ends. The voice you've been silencing the hidden cost of never saying what you mean. There is a kind of exhaustion that has nothing to do with how much you've done and everything to do with how much you've suppressed. You know this exhaustion. It lives in the shoulders, in the jaw, in the low-grade tension that follows you through days when nothing in particular went wrong. And yet you feel as if you've been carrying something heavy the entire time. What you've been carrying is the weight of everything you didn't say, the feedback you swallowed in the meeting because it felt risky, the boundary you didn't hold because the conversation seemed too difficult, the preference you pretended not to have because it was easier to agree, the feeling you labeled not a big deal until it became one, and by then it had calcified into resentment. And resentment is one of the heaviest things a person can carry. Most of us learned to suppress our voices long before we were conscious of learning anything. We absorbed, early, the lesson that certain kinds of expression were safe and others were not, that some feelings were acceptable and others were inconvenient, that some needs were legitimate and others were a burden. We learned to edit ourselves before speaking, to run internal calculations about whether what we want to say is worth the potential cost. And over time, the editing became automatic. We stopped noticing we were doing it. We just found ourselves again and again in rooms and relationships where we were somehow less present than we could be. The suppression feels like protection. In many cases, it was protection, learned in environments where self-expression genuinely carried risk. But the behavior that protected you in one context becomes a constraint in another. And the person who learned to stay quiet, to stay safe, is not the same person who now, in a different life, different relationships, different conditions, needs to be able to say what they think and mean what they say, and hold a boundary without it being the end of something. That skill, the skill of honest, grounded, clear expression, has to be relearned. Not as performance, not as aggression, as simple, direct, authentic communication. Here is what I think. Here is what I need. Here is what does not work for me. This is harder than it sounds. It requires tolerating the moment before you know how the other person will respond, which is one of the most uncomfortable moments in human interaction. It requires accepting that you cannot control the reception, only the quality and honesty of the communication itself. It requires being willing to be misunderstood, disagreed with, or temporarily disappointing, without retracting what you said in order to restore the other person's comfort. Sophia grew up in Santiago, Chile, the older of two sisters, in a household where her role had been, without anyone explicitly assigning it, to be the manageable one. The one who didn't add to the family's difficulties, the one who figured it out without being asked. She became extraordinarily capable, exquisitely attuned to other people's emotional states, and almost completely opaque about her own needs. This wasn't cruelty, it was adaptation. She adapted so well that by the time she reached her mid-30s, she genuinely wasn't sure what she needed, only that she was always slightly tired and that something was missing. What was missing was her own voice in the story of her life. She had been present, dependable, contributing, thoughtful. But she had not been herself, fully. She had been a very polished, very functional version of herself that other people found easy to be around because she was so carefully calibrated not to be difficult. And not difficult is a profound thing to sacrifice yourself for. Sophia started small, not with the big conversations, not with the family dynamics or the long-standing professional frustrations. She started in low-stakes moments. She told a colleague that she preferred a different approach to a shared project. She told a friend that she was too tired for plans they'd made and needed to reschedule. She told her sister that something she'd said had hurt her, briefly, simply, without drama. None of these conversations ended relationships. None of them produced the catastrophe she had been quietly anticipating for decades. Most of them produced understanding or adjustment or simply the satisfaction of having been honest, which it turns out produces a particular kind of quiet energy that the effort of suppression does not. Gradually, the voice that had been edited into near silence began to find its register again. Not louder, clearer, not more aggressive, more grounded. She began to say what she meant and mean what she said, and hold her positions when they were questioned without immediately capitulating. And the extraordinary thing happened. The people in her life didn't like her less. Several of them told her they felt they finally knew her. Because here is what nobody tells you about authentic expression. It is not a performance of strength. It is an act of intimacy. When you tell someone what you actually think, what you actually feel, what you actually need, you are giving them access to you, the real you, not the curated version. And real connection requires real access. The relationships that feel thin and surface level often feel that way because both people are too careful, too edited, too safe. Depth requires the vulnerability of saying the thing that might not be perfectly received. Your voice, the specific, personal, particular way you see the world, is not incidental to your relationships. It is what makes them real. When you suppress it, you don't just protect yourself from criticism, you also prevent yourself from being genuinely known. You become someone who is around but not present, someone who is reliable but unknowable. And that kind of loneliness, the loneliness of being unseen in the company of people who think they see you, is one of the most isolating experiences there is. This applies everywhere. In professional settings, where the people who get heard are the ones who speak, not always loudly, but clearly and persistently. In friendships, where the depth you want requires the willingness to say the uncomfortable thing at the table rather than processing it alone afterward. In the most intimate relationships, where the habit of swallowed feelings is one of the primary mechanisms by which love erodes, and it applies in the relationship you have with yourself. The internal voice, the one that runs almost constantly underneath everything you're doing, tells you things about what you want, what you need, what is wrong and what is right. Most people have learned to override this voice in favor of external signals, what is expected, what is approved, what looks right to others. Over time, the internal voice gets quieter, not because it has less to say, but because it has been so consistently ignored that it has learned not to bother. Your voice is not loud enough if no one, including you, can hear it. Relearning to hear it, and then to act on what you hear, is one of the most important things you can do. Not because you should be self-absorbed, but because the self-knowledge it produces is the foundation of every good decision you will ever make. You cannot consistently make choices that are right for you if you have lost the ability to hear yourself. And you cannot build a life that genuinely fits if you don't know who you actually are. Start where it's small, not with the big confrontations. Those will come when they're necessary, and you'll be ready for them because you've practiced. Start with the daily, low-stakes moments of honest expression. The preference you voice instead of suppressing. The boundary you hold instead of dissolving. The feeling you name instead of labeling fine. Each one of those small moments builds the muscle. Each honest word is an act of practice. And the person who has practiced, who has spent weeks and months and years learning to say what they mean, handles the big moments differently. Not perfectly, but differently, with more ground under their feet. Make your voice heard, not tomorrow, now. The daily decisions that build empires, time, values, resilience, and the life you're constructing, right now. Your time is your life. Treat it accordingly. Your time is not a resource. It is your life. Every hour you spend is a piece of your finite existence allocated to something. And unlike money, unlike energy, unlike almost every other currency you trade in, time is the one thing you cannot earn back, borrow more of, or find under a different name somewhere else. When it is spent, it is gone. And the question of where it goes is therefore one of the most important questions you will ever answer. Most people never answer it intentionally. They answer it by default, by saying yes when they should have thought more carefully, by being available in ways that slowly drain them, by filling their hours with the urgent at the expense of the important, until they arrive at the end of weeks and months, with a vague sense of having been very busy, but an inability to point to what they actually built. The people who drain your time are not always difficult. Sometimes they are charming, familiar, even beloved. But there is a particular category of relationship, in professional settings, in social circles, in families, in neighborhoods, where the transaction is consistently one-directional. You give, they take, not maliciously often, simply because the dynamic has been established and it will continue to operate as long as you permit it to. Recognizing this pattern does not require anger or blame. It requires honest accounting. When you leave a certain person's company, do you feel expanded or contracted? Are you energized by the interaction? Or do you find yourself needing time to recover from it? These are not trivial questions. They are measurements of how your most valuable resource is being affected by a specific input. Nadia works in the non-profit sector in Nairobi, Kenya, where the culture of her organization, and, to a significant extent, her own self-concept, rewarded availability. Being the person who always answered, always helped, always stayed late, always found a way. She was proud of this quality. She saw it as a strength. And it was a strength, genuinely, until it became the primary way people related to her, and the quality of the relationships depended on her continued provision of something she no longer had the capacity to give. She began, slowly and with significant internal resistance, to practice what she called honest allocation. She started tracking, informally, where her time and attention were going. Not to optimize it like a machine, but to see it clearly. What she saw was that approximately 40% of her mental and emotional energy was going to a handful of people who were not contributing to her life in any meaningful way. Not enemies, not terrible people. Simply people whose relationship with her had calcified into a pattern of extraction. She didn't cut anyone off. She simply began being less immediately available. She stopped responding to non-urgent messages at night. She declined 2 invitations per week that she had previously accepted out of obligation rather than genuine desire. She redirected the energy those choices freed up toward 3 relationships she had been neglecting. Relationships that were actually nourishing, actually reciprocal, actually worth her time. Within 4 months, she felt like a different person. She hadn't changed her circumstances dramatically. She had changed the direction of her attention. And attention, it turns out, is the deepest thing you can give or withhold. Where your attention goes, your life goes, and you have far more control over your attention than most people ever exercise. This is not about becoming selfish. It is about becoming conscious. The person who gives everything to everyone, without discrimination, without care for their own depletion, eventually has nothing left to give anyone. They burn out, and the people who needed their best self are left with their emptied self instead. Protecting your energy is not a luxury. It is a prerequisite for being genuinely useful. So begin the honest accounting, not to judge yourself for past allocations. Those are done. But to make better choices from here, ask of every significant relationship, every regular obligation, every recurring commitment, does this deserve the best of me, or has it been receiving the best of me by default, while the things that actually matter get my remainder? The values you say you have versus the ones you live by. Here is the most honest question you can ask about your values. Not what are they, but where do they show up? Because values are not what you write in a journal or state in a job interview or commit to in a moment of resolution. Values are what you actually do when it costs you something. When honesty is uncomfortable, when integrity is inconvenient, when the choice that aligns with what you claim to believe is also the harder choice. What do you do? The gap between stated values and lived values is one of the most reliable sources of internal conflict in the human experience. Most people feel it as a vague unease, the sense that something doesn't quite add up, that they are slightly out of alignment with themselves. They can't always name it, but it is always there, a kind of friction between who they tell themselves they are and who their daily choices actually reveal them to be. This is not a moral failure. It is the inevitable result of living in a world where external pressure is constant and internal clarity is not. Everyone compromises their values sometimes. The question is whether the compromise is conscious or unconscious, whether you are aware you are making a trade-off and make it deliberately, or whether you have drifted so far from your own principles that you've stopped noticing the drift. The first step to alignment is definition, not the abstract definition, not "I value honesty" as a statement, but the specific behavioral definition. What does honesty look like in the situation you are actually in? What does it require of you specifically today? Not in a moral philosophy essay. In this relationship, this meeting, this decision you're avoiding. When values are defined at the level of specific behavior, they become harder to avoid. You can nod along to the abstract version all day. The specific version confronts you. Rafael has been a journalist in Mexico City for 20 years. He came into journalism with a clear value around truth-telling, the kind of clarity that young people carry into their professions, bright and slightly abstract. Over the years, the pressures of working in an industry under financial stress, in a media environment shaped by complicated political and economic forces, had gradually softened the edges of that clarity. Not dramatically, incrementally. A story slightly shaped, a source slightly protected beyond what accuracy required, an angle chosen because it was easier, not because it was most true. At 51, working on what would become his most significant long-form investigation, he made a series of decisions that aligned completely with the value he had stated at 23 and half abandoned in the years between. It cost him access. It cost him the comfort of certain relationships. It cost him sleep. And it produced the most important work of his career, work that he could look at without equivocation and call entirely his. He described the experience as returning to the room I'd been standing outside of for years. Not dramatic, not redemptive in a cinematic sense, just the quiet recognition of himself in the work after a long absence. Your values are not aspirational. They are instructional. They are telling you at all times what to do. The question is whether you are listening, or whether the noise of convenience, approval, and comfort has drowned them out. Listen more carefully, then act on what you hear. Repeatedly in the small moments before the large moments require it of you. When everything falls apart and you don't, there will be a chapter in your life when everything you thought was stable turns out not to be. Maybe it's already happened. The thing you were counting on doesn't arrive. The person you depended on leaves. The plan you had constructed carefully meets reality and breaks apart in ways that feel both sudden and, in retrospect, inevitable. And you are left standing in the wreckage, needing to find a version of yourself that can function in conditions you did not design and did not choose. This is not a hypothetical. This is the human experience. Every person who has lived long enough has a chapter like this. Many people have several. And the determining factor of what comes after, not whether you recover, but who you become through the process, is not luck or support or external resources. It is the quality of your relationship with difficulty itself. Most of us were not taught how to fail well. We were taught that failure was bad, that it indicated a deficit, that it should be minimized, hidden, corrected as quickly as possible, and ideally not repeated. This is understandable education for a world that rewards success and punishes its absence, but it produces people who are fragile in specific and predictable ways, who handle things well when things are going well, who struggle to function when they don't, who take setbacks personally in a way that makes recovery harder and learning from the setback nearly impossible. Failing well, processing difficulty in a way that produces growth rather than damage, is a skill, a learnable, practicable, improvable skill. And like all skills, it is developed not in comfortable conditions, but in the specific context where it is needed, in the actual failure, the actual disappointment, the actual period of uncertainty when you don't know how things will resolve. Elena is a product designer in Sydney, Australia, who spent 3 years building a startup that ultimately failed to secure the funding it needed to survive. She shut it down on a Friday afternoon in March. She spent the weekend, by her account, in a state she couldn't quite name. Not grief, exactly. Not anger. Something more like vertigo. The coordinates of her life, for 3 years, had been the company. Without it, she didn't know which direction was forward. What she did next was not heroic. She did not immediately launch a new venture or embrace the failure as a gift or find the silver lining in a weekend. She sat with it. She called people she trusted. She was honest about how bad it felt. She did not perform resilience for an audience. She was actually resilient, which looked much less impressive from the outside. It looked like a person going through something hard without catastrophizing it. 2 months later, she was working again. Not in the same direction. The failure had given her information that changed what she wanted to build. 18 months after that, she had built something smaller, more sustainable, better fitted to the reality of the market she was operating in. She describes the failed company not as a mistake, but as the most expensive, most efficient education she's ever received. The ability to recover is not something you have or don't have. It is something you build incrementally through every encounter with difficulty that you survive and learn from. Every time you go through something hard and come out the other side changed but functional, not unaffected, changed, you make the next hard thing a little more navigable. Not because it becomes easier, because you have more evidence of your own capacity. This is what resilience actually is. Not the absence of being knocked down, the shortening of the time you stay there. The people who seem unbreakably strong are not people who have been protected from difficulty. They are people who have been broken in enough places to know that they can be repaired, who carry the specific confidence that comes from having been through something and emerged still themselves on the other side. And here is what makes the difference in those hard chapters: the quality of your relationship with your own mind. When things are going wrong, the internal narrative is the most important variable. The mind that catastrophizes, that collapses a setback into evidence of permanent failure, that expands a single bad chapter into a verdict on the whole story. That mind makes recovery harder than it needs to be. Not because the circumstances are worse, but because the story told about the circumstances is more damaging than the circumstances themselves. The mind that can hold a setback as information, as data, as feedback, as a chapter rather than the conclusion, recovers faster. Not because it denies the difficulty, but because it places the difficulty in a frame that allows for continuation. This is what is happening. It is not what will always happen. I have been through something like this before. I will be through this one too. Resilience is built in the ordinary days. It is called upon in the extraordinary ones. The small decisions that determine everything you have been reading about big things: life direction, authentic expression, values, resilience. These are real, important, worth the time you've given them here. But the truth is, and this is the truth that this entire guide has been building toward, none of it happens in the big moments. The big moments are simply the visible surface of something that has been built quietly, consistently, in the small moments, in every daily decision that seemed too insignificant to take seriously, in every choice that was made by habit rather than intention, in every morning that either set the day up or let it happen. The life you have 5 years from now is being constructed today. Not in the abstract, In the specific, granular, almost tediously small choices you are making right now. How you spend the next hour, whether you do the thing you said you would, whether you have the conversation that needs having, whether you protect the time that needs protecting, whether you speak the truth that is trying to be heard. Every one of these choices is a deposit or a withdrawal, an investment in or a surrender of the person you are becoming. And the accounting runs whether or not you're aware of it. You do not have to be a philosopher to improve it. You do not have to understand all the dynamics at play. You simply have to choose, in each of these small moments, a little more deliberately than you have been. Ahmad grew up in Amman, Jordan, and built a career in international development that took him across 3 continents over 20 years. He has worked in settings of genuine crisis, resource shortages, displacement, institutional failures, and he has also worked in ordinary offices doing the ordinary work of institutions. In both contexts, he has observed the same pattern. The people who thrive long-term are not the ones who perform the most dramatically under pressure. They are the ones who maintain their quality, their integrity, their engagement, in the unremarkable days that make up the vast majority of a career and a life. The hard days make the news, he says. The ordinary days make the person. This is as true for you as it is for anyone. The ordinary days are where it happens. The Tuesday afternoon when you could phone it in and almost certainly no one would notice. The Friday evening when you could let the commitment slide because you're tired and no one would judge you for it. The relationship conversation you could defer because today isn't the right time, knowing that there will always be a reason that today isn't the right time. These are the moments, not dramatic, not cinematic, just real, just the actual stuff of your actual life, happening constantly in the most ordinary register. And in each one, there is a choice. The choice that compounds toward the life you want, or the choice that compounds toward the life you settled for. The remarkable thing, the thing that should both humble and electrify you, is that the compounding is not finished. It is happening right now, in the choices you are making today, and will make tomorrow, and the day after. There is no moment at which the accounting closes while you are alive. There is always another deposit available, another chance to choose the version of yourself you are most proud of. The life you rewrite every day, that is the life being written right now. In the daily practice of small, deliberate, unglamorous choices that produce something extraordinary, a life that is actually yours. Conclusion. The decision you make today. This guide has covered a great deal of territory. The morning architecture of intention, the importance of knowing what you actually want, the cost of postponing growth, the necessity of your authentic voice, the power of protecting your time and energy, the wisdom of living by your values rather than just stating them, the skill of resilience built in the ordinary days before it is needed in the extraordinary ones. All of it points to the same place, today. Not the future version of you with better habits and more clarity. This version, today, in these circumstances, with whatever is already in motion. Because the insight without the action is just a pleasant afternoon. And the action, however small, however imperfect, however far from the finished version, that is where the actual life begins. What is one decision you can make today that the person you want to become would be proud of? Not tomorrow, not after you've read more, prepared more, felt more ready. Today. Write it down. Tell someone. And then do it. Not because it will transform everything at once, but because it will transform the next moment, and the moment after that, and, over time, through the patient, unremarkable, extraordinary accumulation of daily decisions, everything. Your life is a manuscript still being written, and you are its author. Not someday, today, right now. A final reminder to carry with you. You are not behind. You are not too late. You are not too broken, too busy, too set in your ways. You are simply someone who has not yet made the next decision. Make it.